Joseph Lindsley is a traveler and writer and an American reporting for Chicago's WGN radio from Ukraine each and every weekday of Russia's full-scale war. He was once protege to Fox News founder Roger Ailes, but Lindsley escaped that frenzied world where power mattered more than truth. And I think we definitely need to touch on that in the wake of Tucker Carlson's visit to Moscow and subsequent events, which, if anything, have eclipsed that visit. Joseph, welcome to the channel again for our monthly chat.
Jonathan, great to see you. And so much has happened since we spoke last. The last time we talked, I was in Kharkiv. Now I'm in Kyiv. On actually today, the day we're speaking, February 20th, is the 10-year anniversary of really some of the most dramatic moments of Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution. And Jonathan, as I think, tomorrow I'm going east, and as we approach the 2-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion, and I was thinking today, 2 years ago when this started, I was in Lviv. I was about as far as you could imagine, be from Russia when the full-scale invasion happened, and it was still terrifying. It was, we didn't know what to expect, and it was absolutely terrifying. And here I am, 2 years later, still the war goes on, and I'm going as close as a civilian can be to the border with Russia. It's amazing how our perspectives on what is scary can change, and how we can adapt. As I have seen everyone around me here in Ukraine adapt these past 2 years.
And who'd have thought that Russia at this point would be still fighting 2 years in and would have thrown tens of thousands of lives away, thousands of units of armored cars, equipment, artillery pieces to take Avdiivka. Okay, there's a bit of strategy there, but it's not a hugely strategic town. This is largely throwing away a vast amount of human life on something that essentially is a bit of political symbolism. Who'd have thought that that's where we'd be at 2 years in?
Indeed. And I mean, think about back to the spring and summer of 2022. Almost every week, a city was falling in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass. I was in Dnipro at the time, and I remember hearing these stories of people that had just been in Bakhmut, and everyone was thinking, oh, Bakhmut's going to fall in the next fortnight sometime. And it didn't. All of a sudden, everything changed. A lot of that was coincident with the arrival of weapons like the HIMARS from the United States. But it's amazing how I think it's important not to remember how dire and how everything seemed to be slipping away, and 2 years ago. And then think about now. I mean, here I am in Kyiv. It was snowing today. It's cold. It's February 20th, so we're well into winter. We've already turned the corner towards spring. You can see I have electricity. I don't hear the hum of generators as we did last year. Last year, Ukraine was in the Middle Ages. It's amazing to think about it. But often there was no hot water, no electricity for many hours of the day throughout Ukraine, even in the major cities, because of Russia's infrastructure attacks. And that's not happening at all. I remember if you look at headlines from last summer and fall, it was a common trope in the media. Oh, Ukraine's preparing for Russia's horrible infrastructure attacks, and the infrastructure was so weak that Russia's going to totally decimate it and erase it this winter. And I always love to follow up on those Armageddon headlines to see, well, where are we now? And this is a story that gets eclipsed with every, whether it's by the Navalny news or other stuff. This is a major story: is that Russia's winter offensive failed last year, and they're not even trying it this year. Is extraordinary news.
The other extraordinary thing, I think, is that certainly Ukrainians I speak to in London, I mean, they're still resilient, but there is a certain negative mood. I mean, first of all, it's 2 years in, everyone's exhausted, but I think also they can't help but be influenced by the generally sort of negative tone of the broad sweep of the sort of mass media, the press in the West. And yet, as you say, the lights are on, the heating's on, extraordinary successes compared to this time last year. And you've got incredible defenses ringed, especially around Kiev. And you've got Patriot batteries taking out Russian airplanes, it seems, on a near daily basis. So there's a lot that could boost people's positivity. Why do you think the press is still whipping up this sort of whirlwind of negativity? And how does it affect Ukrainians in Ukraine? Because I know the mood is not great outside.
Well, I think, this is what we have to remember. I mean, Russia's aim is the destruction of Ukraine. If we look to we can't call it an interview, but the lecture that Putin gave to Tucker Carlson, there weren't enough questions to call it an interview. Putin once again made clear the idea is that he's long postulated that Ukraine doesn't exist, that the Ukrainian language doesn't even exist, and it's something he wants totally erased. And so, if anything, that interview should be a reminder that Putin wants to win. He wants to destroy this country, and so if you want to win, you'll do anything that it takes. I mean, if you're willing to throw billions of dollars worth of missiles at a country every week, you're also willing to manipulate information and lie. I mean, that's cheaper to do. And so certainly that's part of this. And, I think we can never underestimate the mental chess game that the Kremlin plays. And that is, I think, something they're very good at, very practiced at, something you've studied a lot, Jonathan, and going back to the Soviet times. But take, for example, the news of the death of Navalny, the Russian dissident, which, by the way, we talk about Navalny because there's not many Russian dissidents. It's a huge nation, and we're fixated on this one person. Meanwhile, as I realize here every day, Ukraine is a nation of Navalny's, and I think that has gotten totally missed in this narrative with the death of Navalny. But the reason why we talk about him is because he's a unique thing in Russia. But this country is Navalny's from east to west. Whether you're the students studying in the subway schools in Kharkiv, or the former IT professionals who were civilians and are now soldiers. This is the story of resistance here. But it's the Navalny's death happened during the Munich Security Conference. So normally, the focus of the Munich Security Conference probably should have been on, long-range weapons for Ukraine. Are we really serious about turning this around? Instead, it was on Navalny. You have, I read entire articles talking about Navalny with nary a mention of Ukraine. I'm praising him, and a total disconnect from what's happening here. In fact, Garry Kasparov, also a Russian, and he's been a strong voice against Putin and in favor of Ukraine, the chess grandmaster. He wrote in the Wall Street Journal on February 20th, today, that precisely this, that the death of Navalny took the focus away from Ukraine at the Munich Security Forum. And so we have to be aware of these information games. And, one thing I say to Ukrainians, because of my time in New York and Washington, and I see how people get sucked into these narratives, anytime we want to respond to something, we first have to step back and say, wait, what are we getting pulled into? For example, when Tucker Carlson met with Putin just a couple of weeks ago, Putin had this 30-minute lecture about 988 AD. He was taking the Ukrainian history and co-opting it as Russian. And the first impulse of me and everyone here is to start correcting him, to get sucked into that. And I think that's exactly what they want. All of a sudden, we're talking about something 1,000 years ago, America's yawning, blah, blah, blah. And what matters is what's happening now. What matters is also what did happen 10 years ago from this very day. I mean, just a few blocks from me here in Kyiv, on this day, February 20th, for months, the people had been gathered in the Maidan, the main square of Kyiv. Today was one of the most violent days in 2014. The secret police killed 77 protesters, and they stood there. I just watched a video of people singing the Ukrainian national anthem. You could hear the smoke bombs of the secret police, and they refused to budge. And so this was like a square full of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Navalny's, Ukrainians, old and young, men and women, refusing to budge. And as a result of what happened, what culminated on this day, on the following day, February 21st, the pro-Putin regime began to flee. And so this is what matters. And actually, if you listen to Putin, the one true thing he said to Tucker Carlson was that this is about 2014. He sort of let that leak, and he's got a different interpretation of it. But this is precisely, if the Ukrainians in 2014 had not said we refuse to leave this square, even if you shoot us, then they would currently be in the Russian realm of influence, perhaps unleashing some kind of hell upon Europe. And actually, Kasparov made the same point. He said that the Russia he's Kasparov in that Wall Street Journal story said Russia has let down Navalny, they've let down Russians, and they've let down the world because of their nihilism and inaction. And Ukrainians, those events 10 years ago, and everything they do every day that I see around me, are the opposite of that. It's a values-based resistance and action. And so this is the question for the world. Will we be on the side of nihilism or the side of virtue and values?
I mean, of course, if there were more people with Navalny's characteristics, we may not be facing the kind of challenges that we face right now from Russia. And, I mean, Ukrainians will have a certain point of view on Navalny. Usually it's rather negative. They'll often quote the thing about, Crimea not being a sandwich. So he has said and done some things which really kind of missed the mark, and you can definitely critique it. What a lot of the critiques fail to mention, however, is that he changed, and he's changed his point of view. And on numerous occasions while in prison following the full-scale invasion, he's laid out very, very clearly his point of view that the sovereignty of Ukraine is not up for debate, in that the 1991 borders would need to be respected. That implies Crimea gets handed back, and he's certainly changed his position on that. What I think is interesting, and it's worth listening to, again, I don't want to take away from the personal grief, which I think is very real, of Navalny's wife. And she's announced that she's stepping up, and she's going to take a lead role in the FBK, his organization there, the fund against corruption. But if you listen to all her speeches, from the Oscar acceptance speech last year to the speech yesterday, she never once mentions Ukraine. She mentions the terrible suffering of Russians, which is real, mentions the sort of terror and the huge destruction of resources and potential. This is all true. But she never once mentioned Ukraine. And I find that quite disturbing in some ways. However, it's worth saying that Navalny's team, for good or ill, mention Ukraine on a daily basis, many times a day, and they call out the invasion as being illegal. They underscore the need for reparations, and they do call out the sort of criminality that is being committed by Russian forces on the territory of Ukraine. So I think it's worth having a sort of balanced point of view there. But it does still seem to me, even despite that sort of speech there, that the Navalny team is still very much in this space of, I would call it, vegetarian tactics. I've used the phrase, they're turning up for a knife fight with a spoon, and they are fighting a regime which is not actually, as many of the media have labeled it, fragile, scared. No, the murder of Navalny suggests that Putin is more confident now than he was last year, more confident in gaining some kind of victory in Ukraine, more confident in his control over his own country, more confident that he can still get components for weapons, income from oil, and so on. Do you think this is sort of correct? And are vegetarian tactics really going to make any headway against this regime, which seems to be more bullish than ever?
I think you explained this well. And Jonathan, as I've been reflecting on this the past few days, looking at the situation in the United States, thinking of Navalny's death, thinking of the Tucker-Putin conversation, I think that the Kremlin's tactic, at least as I see it, actually working pretty well in the U.S., and this is a bit, it's maybe a bit more direct, but this is the idea. I'm going to phrase it more directly than maybe it really is, but is to scare the Democrats, the people who want to believe in Ukraine, to scare them, to say, look what we can do. We're the big bad wolf, and to fool the Republicans. So to convince the Republicans that Ukraine is everything that it's not a nation of faith, family, freedom, and to scare the Democrats, if you support Ukraine, look what we're going to do. We're going to wreak havoc upon the world. And I think we see a bit of this in the reaction to the death of Navalny. As Kasparov pointed out in that Wall Street Journal piece, the West seems intent on duplicating the apathy of the Russians. I don't think the West is intending to be apathetic. They're not nihilistic like the Russians, but we see this with So as soon as we had the news of Navalny's death, and then all the meetings in Munich, President Biden and many others, EU officials said, "Oh, we need stronger sanctions now on Russia because of the death of Navalny." And that's very interesting because if they had been serious these past 2 years, now we're approaching the 2-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion. If they were serious about the children who've been killed and kidnapped and deported into places in Russia, the civilians who were forced to be soldiers because they have no choice or their country is overtaken, by all the Ukrainians who were killed, civilians sleeping in their beds, soldiers at the front line. If they were serious about that, about Ukraine's stand, would they not at this point have done every possible sanction that was feasible? You know, why all of a sudden is it when one Russian dissident dies, it's time for serious sanctions? And this is, here's where I think we have to really watch what a good chess player the Kremlin is. They, successfully divert attention away from Ukraine. As you said, I mean, at the Academy Awards a year ago, they honored Navalny. They had the documentary about him, and they had Navalny's wife there, and nary a word about Ukraine. And it's all about the poor, beleaguered Russians. And this is the victim mentality that has gotten us into this place. It's again, that's why I call Russia the school shooter of nations. Everyone was mean to me. I'm going to shoot everyone. Everyone better just be afraid and get away from me. Ukrainians are the total opposite of that mentality. But that reality is getting sort of smothered up in this time. And we see it really mystifies me, Jonathan. Like, yeah, sanctions for Navalny's death, and I look and I hear. I mean, everyone I talk to here, whether it's people preparing to go to the front because they know their time is coming, people who have lost their businesses, people who've been conscripted, every element of this society, and yet people are refusing to give up. I don't see any indication of that anywhere, and yet Navalny is the hero that everyone has to care about. I think this is one good lesson we can take from Navalny. He did have courage. He went back to Russia knowing what was going to happen, and I think that's where maybe the solution is for the rest of the world. Like, I know people in Washington, they're far away from this. It's the further away you are, the easier it is to be scared. I mean, last we talked, I was in Kharkiv, and it was scary. I mean, almost every other day, their missiles were hitting all around me, sometimes very extremely close. But I was not afraid because I was surrounded by people that believed in something, and sort of as people were 10 years ago at Maidan. And when you're surrounded by those people, you get through the fear and you work to find solutions, and you see the possibility that this can work. But when you're far away, it's hard to see that possibility. It's hard to have that courage. And so I think that's one reason why we see this. In some ways, people would rather talk about Navalny than talk about the more difficult atrocities that are happening right now, because that would force you to really act. And I don't know if you saw at the Super Bowl, President Biden released a TikTok video where he was talking about shrinkflation and how packages are getting smaller. No, packages are getting bigger of junk food, but the food is getting smaller. Okay, sure, it's a problem, but there's a lot of other stuff going on. And I think he was speaking in the White House movie theater, and next to him, he had an array of junk food packages or not so healthy food. And one of them was a package of Oreos. And Oreo cookies is owned by Mondelez International, which is a company that continues to do, despite all of the sanctions, continues to do business in Russia. They claim that they're giving essential nutrients to the Russians. Part of me maybe is thinking, okay, feed them junk food. Maybe that's better. It'll weaken them. But the fact is, so Oreo, and anyone who's been involved in Ukraine knows full well that Mondelez is one of the great offenders of they get around the sanctions through loopholes. They make lots of money in Russia, and Oreo is one of their most distinguished brands. And if the White House is serious about their sanctions, who's thinking about this? Like, even the optics of that sends a message. It sends a message to the Kremlin, hey, we're not so serious, which is the worst message you could send. And it sends a message to Ukrainians of, we don't really care for you. And then 2 weeks later, when Navalny dies, we see all of a sudden they start to care. That I have many questions about that. I think we need a lot of self-introspection in the U.S. about what we really care about, and what matters to us.
And we can extend this to another areas, can't we? So you've got oil, And it's only recently that the US administration started really starting to try and close some of the loopholes against oil. You've got 300 billion in Russian assets, frozen Russian assets. Those essentially are sitting, almost all of it, in a single bank in Belgium, really waiting for the green light. That would send a very clear signal that we are serious about this, and that that there are real consequences to what Russia does. You also have components, chips in consumer goods that are actually able to make their way via a whole load of routes to the Russian war machine. I saw one article, I think, which is saying that actually the Russian war machine is far more effective actually at cannibalizing these components and has retooled far more than we were expecting, which of course is extremely dangerous. Plus, are we disrupting the supply of drones from Iran, etc.? The list goes on and on and on. And all of these, as you say, are signals that we're really not serious. We're really not prepared to take any pain, economic or political pain ourselves. Therefore, I think that is feeding Putin's swagger. I mean, is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. Especially that's why I say when you're far away from it, this can seem insurmountable. If within the massive nation of Russia, the one of the few rare voices who can stand up is deleted, of course, if that's the only information you have, it looks like, well, this is too much. Let's just kind of give up and cool it down. But that's why I say, but if you look intensely at Ukraine, what Ukrainians have done since those amazing days of the Maidan Revolution 10 years ago, which I know, I mean, almost everyone I know here was part of that revolution in some way. I've been here since the pandemic. These are deeply personal stories I hear from people. Even I was talking with people in Lviv so 10 years ago from today, or from this week. The people started in droves to go by train and bus and car from different cities around Ukraine to Kyiv to be in the main square to say, and even especially when they heard that the secret police were attacking, that inspired people not to run away, but to go to the fight and to stand in the square. And then in Lviv, word leaked out that the secret police were going to block the highways to Kyiv. And as soon as that word leaked out, people got in their cars in the city of Lviv and blocked the secret police headquarters. And so the spirit of, yeah, it seems impossible that you can go against these massive elite machines, but Ukrainians have shown that it is possible. And in fact, they've been so strong that now, Russia is sending billions of dollars of missiles almost every week to this country, and it's still not working. And so I would say, that if especially if you're here, you're surrounded by the stories of courage and inspiration. It's even as dark as it seems. It's hard to imagine that victory won't happen. And so I think a lot of it depends on who you're surrounded by during this time. And the more sort of and Russia banks on that. I mean, that's why routinely we see the positive stories about Ukraine eclipsed. I mean, last fall, if Hamas had not attacked Israel, the headlines would have been, "What is Russia doing?" Because there were so few attacks away from the front lines in Ukrainian cities all fall, and so, but that was all covered up by what was happening in Israel, and so Russia knows how to play this extremely well, and I think in our American demagoguery, we sort of get caught up in the moment and in the frenzy, and again, I do think that the Kremlin is successfully scaring the Democrats and fooling the Republicans.
That's a form of coercive control. We see this also playing out, I would say, to some extent in Poland. I mean, Hungary, Serbia, they're already, I would say, they've gone very far down the path of being corrupted, although we have seen protests over the last couple of days in Hungary. So there is some possibility there that democratic forces may sort of start to go on the offensive there. But worryingly, we see the entire Polish border being blockaded by farmers, and not just Polish this time. There seem to be farmers from other countries in Europe, but also it has been shown that there are very strong links between the far right and those organizations have demonstrable links with Russia, and one must assume with the sort of the SVR or whatever it is, the Russian foreign intelligence services. What do we, I mean, this isn't just an American problem here. Russia seems to be able to activate agents, useful idiots, assets right across the world to help advance its agenda.
Yeah, for example, look at the blockade. Just take an example of Poland, and allegedly the farmers blockading, not only blockading Ukrainian grain, but actually dumping it out, wasting his precious grain, and uh, and astounded because Poland would seem to, has seemed to be such an ally of Ukraine, because also they, have a history of Russia wanting to take over Poland as well. And this is where I think we can see, unfortunately, some of the brilliance of the information efforts of the Kremlin. So these efforts, these blockades of the border, serve to discourage those who would care about Ukraine. It makes it just another problem. Oh, now we have to somehow deal with this, put out this fire, and it takes our focus away from talking about getting long range weapons to the Ukrainians and permission for Ukrainians to hit the Russian bases from which they attack places like Kharkiv and Nikopol. And so it wears people down, and then very shrewdly it inspires people who in the West, whether they're on the right or the left, who are fed up with they feel that the elites who govern them are out of touch. And so we see so many people, especially in the U.S. and other places, identify with anyone resisting outside of Ukraine, which is this is what the Russians do so well. So they're like, oh, look at these. We stand in solidarity with the Polish farmers or protesters in Ireland or whatever, and the Russians sort of push these messages. So if you're disaffected with the elite, stand with these protests, and then for those who believe in Ukraine, look how difficult we're going to make it, and then all this obscures the reality in the middle, which is what Ukrainians are remembering this week. Ukraine's Maidan revolution is one of the best examples in modern history, going back for centuries, of people working together of all different political stripes to resist a machine that seems impossible to resist. They stood in those squares for months. We think of the Ottawa truckers, which many people in America praise for when they're protesting Justin Trudeau's government. When Trudeau's government seized their bank accounts or whatever he did, they went home. When this pro-Putin secret police began to shoot the Ukrainians, more showed up. More people came to the square. And this story has been completely missed. I think part of it's because, Western elites they're never going to truly praise Maidan. I mean, can you imagine President Macron praising Maidan? He's got the yellow vest, those comfortably in power, the Maidan is a threat to them as well. And so the Russians know this, that they're never going to praise Maidan. And so the Russians can lie about it. And they can just convince, many people in the West who are frustrated with the elites that Maidan was created by one person in the State Department. And so they're very good at smudging over the truth because they know how they can play people. And I think this is one reason why I stay here every day in Ukraine, as tired as I get, because I can see this reality, and I feel it's my moral obligation to share it, to share it with the world, and that Ukraine is this unique example. And I mean, I love the story of our American founding. I love British politics too, but I think I love our story of our Constitution, and I think the Maidan Revolution is at least as extraordinary as the Revolution of 1776. And I think more so because it was people from all strata of society. And it was not the elites. It wasn't just about taxes. It was very fundamental about what it means to be free, which means not, oh, I want a government that's my own. No, it means I personally want freedom. And for everyone around me, we're going to live freely. That's very deeply what that revolution was about. And that is what is that's the greatest threat to Putin is people that refuse to be controlled. It's a threat not only to Putin, it's a threat to petty bureaucrats everywhere, but it's especially a threat to Putin. And that's what we see here in Ukraine is the total opposite, the vertical idea of human existence, where you have the people in power and all of the little pawns, and this deeply Ukrainian idea of the horizontal. And that this is so this is why it's difficult, I think, to get a lot of people in the West to really get behind it, if they don't really believe in this radical idea of freedom.
It's very challenging as well, isn't it? Because I think in our societies we've got used to a certain amount of stasis. The fact that we live in extremely turbulent times and that our own democratic systems seem to be increasingly fragile and not fit for the complexity of the times, not responsive enough, and often the sort of combative left-right dynamic prevents us actually tackling the real problems that we've got. This is one of the real threats, isn't it? Because Ukraine has got very, dynamic politics. Ukrainians love to debate, but at the same time, they've been able to park their left-right differences. You have people on the nationalist side who have found commonality with those on the left and the center, people who are espousing lifestyles that they may not agree with in any way or at all. And yet they're fighting side by side in the trenches, and they fought the security services on the Maidan square. That's quite terrifying, probably, that prospect for Western politicians. No wonder they don't want to emphasize it too much.
It's terrifying to the politicians, if they're thinking in the framework of, they're only there for power. But think of the good people that get into government, especially I would say not just people on the left and the right in the U.S. who you first get involved in politics because you believe in this idea of freedom, and you believe in public protests and all that. And Ukraine is really, it's a model for that. Now, in on the bad side, it shows you what happens if you insist on being free. You're going to face the people who have a grip on power. They're going to do everything they can to stop you, and it will come to that type of clash. But it also shows you the incredible power. I mean, the fact that I'm talking to you from Kyiv 2 years now. As I said, I was scared being in Lviv, 30 miles from NATO and EU borders when this started. And now I will go 30 miles to Russia because I'm so inspired and surrounded by the courage and sense of confidence here in Ukraine. And so I think this is where we have to, we can actually take heart in the West and say Ukraine, if we begin to understand Ukraine, it could help us maybe break through some of these barricades in our own politics. And I think it's absolutely necessary. And I think, part of this even goes to, I mean, we need some fix in our American system. I speak as an American here. Like right now, I see the most diehard MAGA or Republican operatives are inaccurately claiming that the Biden White House is sending much more money than it is to Ukraine. Whenever we hear those spending figures, most of that money is going to the U.S. defense industry, and it's not coming anywhere near Ukraine. We've seen the White House never wants to use the word offensive. They, unlike the Brits, they will not give Ukraine permission to hit military bases within Russia. So the White House is actually much weaker than MAGA claim, or much softer on Ukraine than the MAGA people claim it is. But then we see on the other side the most diehard partisans of the Democrats. If you dare criticize the White House, which, by the way, Gary Kasparov did very delicately in his Wall Street Journal piece today. He said, the White House could send ATACMS and long-range weapons. If you do that, you very easily people can say, "Oh, clearly you're a trumpeter, a Trumpist," and we're not able to have a real conversation about this. And because of that, we're making our entire nation vulnerable because the Russians are playing, the Kremlin's playing this so well, and we can't have sort of just a reasoned discussion. And I think of at the Munich Security Conference, one of the strong voices there, I always mispronounce her name. I think, is it Kaja Kallas or Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia? She said, Russia's aim is to make us step back, to refrain from the decisions that we want to take, to make us be scared. And here's where we have to prove them wrong. But it's very hard to do that if we're fighting amongst ourselves. And I think the best way is if somehow we can show more and more people around the world who are, just regular hardworking people, that Ukraine, Ukraine is this. It shows us the possibility that people can actually live freely. And I mean, I'm surrounded by this every. I mean, okay, we saw the Tucker Carlson nonsense from Moscow. Tucker Carlson goes to a grocery store in Moscow, which, by the way, it looked like a terrible grocery store. And you had to put money in the cart to get the cart, and he was so like, "Oh, this is so high tech."
It's also fairly posh because he's gone to a wealthy area in the center of Moscow, and you'd struggle to find probably those supermarkets even a few miles outside the center.
And even then, the supermarket looked pretty dumpy. And then they don't. It's a society with no trust. So you got to put a coin in the cart to take the cart. In Ukraine, you find lovely grocery stores everywhere, and there's no one's worried about theft or anything like that. It's such a society of trust. As I said, you can walk the streets at night in the dark, and it's safe. And so that's why I tell this story, because this is the possibility of how life, even when there's missiles coming down around you during the air raid alarms, that life can be something peaceful and extraordinary and harmonious and purposeful. And Ukrainians are showing that. And another key story that's been missed that shows how we don't have to live in fear. Take what's happened in the Black Sea. So, and this is regarding the grain exports, which is one of the reasons for the protests in Europe, in Poland and other places. But for almost the first year of Russia's full-scale invasion, the first few months, Ukraine could not export to the Black Sea because Ukraine doesn't really have a navy, and Russia was controlling the Black Sea. And then through Turkey and the United Nations, there was a deal formed where Russia so benevolently agreed to let a certain number of ships from around the world export grain to the Black Sea. That deal expired last summer in July 2023. In the immediate days and weeks after the deal expired, grain prices skyrocketed throughout the world, like more than 11% or so. But then when the deal expired, Ukrainians were free to use their ingenuity and capabilities and to attack the Russian assets that were preventing the grain from being exported. And now we've seen that more grain has been exported after that deal, after the United Nations brokered deal, than during the time when they had this allegedly great agreement. So Ukrainians have been able to export month by month more grain through the Black Sea than, even in a shorter period of time, overall, like 33 tons versus 23 tons, I believe. They've been able to export more grain by attacking with drones Russian ships. And in the past several weeks, they've sank 3 more Russian ships in the Black Sea. Now they're exporting more grain. Prices have come down and stabilized worldwide because of this idea of Ukrainian possibility, by using their ingenuity, and yes, by attacking the Russians and saying, no, we're taking charge of this. Actually, they've made things better off. And it's when you settle and make deals with maniacal school shooting tyrants that things are not so pretty.
And this is the bit that I struggle to understand, because it seems to me that the core values, conservative with a small c values, which are shared very much by, let's say, traditional Republicans, as well as, say, the Conservative Party in the UK, is about taking personal responsibility for your finances, your community, and various things. It's about acting like a responsible citizen. That means behaving like someone who's free and is not, in hock to some kind of power, as you say. Now, I think it's interesting, again, Ukrainians will not necessarily agree with this, but Navalny deported himself, even in prison, like a free person. You may criticize his policies and various things like that, and maybe some of the lack of detail, but he stood up and behaved like a free man. And that is something which very few Russians do. We have Karamazov, Ilya Yashin, and we have a handful of others who are taking responsibility, and they are just in their tone of voice, their stature, their use of humor, and so on. They are refusing to be slaves of the regime. What I don't understand is how people can be taken in by the propaganda that Russia is a land of freedom and traditional values, when quite demonstrably there are only a handful of people who behave like free men. Whereas, as you say, Ukrainians is, a nation of people who are pushing against that container, who are rebelling against authority, and indeed taking responsibility, often for their lives, their finances, their families, and so on.
Well, I think, Jonathan, that's even part of the reason. I suspect that the timing of Navalny's death is not accidental. I mean, the Kremlin's in charge of that whole scenario, and even even the glowing tributes to Navalny are serving a good purpose for the Kremlin right now, in many ways. And one of the key ways is a way that hardly anyone is paying attention to. It's totally ignoring and erasing the idea of what Ukrainians have done these past 2 years. It's erasing it. I mean, like there was a Barry Weiss, who's a great journalist. She had this, at her website, the Free Press, had a very lovingly written tribute to Navalny, and she mentioned a few other Russian dissidents, Natan Sharansky, who's been a supporter of Ukraine, and others, and never once mentions Ukraine. And this is, I think, exactly what the Kremlin wants. To the best, even if he didn't like Navalny, he's like, as long as the best people, the best dissenters are Russian, and this is so much of what he did in his what Putin did in his interview with Tucker Carlson. He said, claiming the history of Ukraine, of Kyiv, for his own. He barely mentioned Moscow in that interview. He talks about Kyiv, because he wants so much the identity of this place, and in the stories of Navalny, we see once again the obscuring of what Ukrainians are and what they're doing every single day. And so I think that's part of the reason for when I talk with people here, I mean, people make a point of saying it took courage for Navalny to go back. I see people making a point. They want me to know that they feel that, but there's this sort of frustration that you're drowning in the narratives of someone else, and that your sacrifice, the sacrifice of the Ukrainians here, which they make every single day, is being erased and obscured or discounted. And as when I look out the window and I see the city of Kyiv moving around me, like every person walking, every car moving, every coffee shop serving, after a missile attack, is an act of resistance. It's an act of absolute and beautiful defiance. Because it's so widespread here, I think it comes to seem commonplace and it gets ignored. But if the Ukrainians stopped acting like that, then this country would fall, and then the dominoes would continue to fall throughout Europe. And so, this is, I think Putin wants us to be focused on Navalny. Yeah, that's not a threat to him. He wants us to talk more and more and more about Navalny, and forget about this nation of Navalny's here.
And there are so many sort of narratives that are designed to limit action that's being taken. Do you think, however, because Biden and his team, as well as Scholz in Germany and Merkel before that, they really did lay out some red lines. One of those red lines was the death of Navalny in custody, never mind what appears to be his murder. I mean, the details that are coming out make it look more and more like that was the case. And in fact, just 2 days before, he was filmed in court via a transmission link, making jokes. I mean, he seemed to be on extraordinary form despite where he was being kept, which is a prison not far from Vorkuta, a place where I've had the dubious honor of actually visiting. I mean, it is a harsh climate, and I mean, just a sort of personal story there. We're on the train from Moscow to Vorkuta, and in the middle of the tundra, the snow's come down. In the middle of the tundra, there is the sort of skeletal wooden remains of a penal colony with the watchtowers, the barbed wire, and of course it's 70 years old or whatever. It's just disappearing into the tundra, and I point out it's an extraordinary sight. Nobody in the train bats an eyelid. Oh, it's nothing. It's just it's whatever. But it's an incredibly harsh place. 9 months of snow cover in the year, in May, the sun does a loop in the sky and you have 20-meter high snowdrifts. I mean, it's a harsh, harsh place. But he did not look like somebody who was, on in his last days. Um, Back to the red lines. If Biden, if Scholz, if other Western leaders do nothing in response, what is this going to be interpreted as in the Kremlin?
Well, unfortunately, I think you know, I think the Kremlin is already expecting the response because we've seen these past 2 years, typically the response from the West. And like, the strange thing that I wish the American press would ask the White House about, but when the White House sent 17 ATACMS, sort of begrudgingly, it seemed, last September, right when Zelensky visited Washington, they gave him this nice gift, 17 ATACMS, long-range weapons. They arrived in October, and within a week, the Ukrainians used them to take out 2 Russian air bases on Ukrainian soil. And then no one said a peep. The press, the White House, no one said anything about, like, wow, oh, you gave these to Ukraine, they worked, and Russia had no major response to it. So much for the red lines. Oh, why not send more if this worked? And there was just nothing in silence. In fact, we had silence really until the White House got to the point where they said, now saying that the Republicans are the only ones holding up aid for Ukraine, and they are. There are Republicans holding up the money that's needed to sustain sort of government and basic functions here. But meanwhile, there's this whole piece missing of, well, every time Ukrainians have seemingly crossed one of these Russian red lines, long-range weapon. When Ukrainians hit the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Crimea with the help of the Brits, which I never want to tire of mentioning. That was just an extraordinary thing. There was no major response. The biggest thing that was back in August. The biggest thing we've seen was Russia's New Year's festivities when they had a bombing spree for several days throughout Ukraine, which is terrifying, but we're still here. And so for these so-called Russian red lines, you see that it's talk. And it's the same from the West. It's the red lines have been crossed so many times. I mean, we've now, since the full-scale invasion started, we've had entire cities wiped off the map near the front. Now the latest being Avdiivka. These no longer red lines. And all of a sudden, the life of one Russian dissident who chose to go back to Russia is somehow kind of a new red line. I think if and this is what I think the Prime Minister of Estonia was getting at. The best response to any of this, so even just looking, if you're responding simply to the headlines and Navalny dying, and Gary Kasparov said this in the Wall Street Journal, the best response is simply this: give Ukraine the weapons they need to push back against Russia and to put an end to this. So that means, for example, like Kyiv, where I am right now, is pretty well protected. But a city like Kharkiv, because the Russians are 30 miles away and Ukrainians do not have means or permission to attack anything on Russian soil, that city is perpetually vulnerable. And what I've seen behind the scenes is that I think that there's a lot of people hoping that Kharkiv, will simply give up and we can have some kind of partition. And then we can have some beautiful, this is what probably Trump is dreaming about. But I think actually also many people who actually want to believe in Ukraine, but because they're scared right now, are also okay with such a scenario, having some kind of partition. And this is the reason why I think, for example, like the F-16, the fighter jets haven't arrived here. They keep pushing that date back further and further because people keep expecting Ukrainians to give up. And they only want the fighter jets here when there's a deal and a partition. And the fighter jets will be there to protect, the free Ukraine. But they're too scared to send them now. And that's what I say, if you come here and you see the absolute refusal of people to give up, it's encouraging. And you begin to see the possibility that this can indeed work. And like I encourage people to go even look at the videos from 10 years ago from the Maidan. There was a Netflix documentary, but watch the raw videos, and I'll put them at my website, ukrainianfreedomnews.com. And just look at the raw videos where you can see people standing in that square with the barricades that they built and the smoke bombs and the attacks of the secret police, and people are singing. They keep singing even as the police are firing, and that is absolute courage. And the good thing is we all don't have to have that type of courage because the Ukrainians have it and they're willing to exercise it. All they're saying is hand us some weapons, and they'll do it. So I think if we can really drill down deep into who these people, the Ukrainians, are, after 2 years, we have plenty of evidence, and say, okay, all we need is a little bit of courage, and it's with all of our actions, let's ask ourselves the question: if I take X, Y, or Z action, I'm in the White House, say, or Brussels, are my words going to put fear into the heart of someone in the Kremlin, or no? And we got to think less about the fear in our own hearts and think about what is the person on the other side thinking about my actions. And if we somehow think that we can sort of send Ukraine weapons, sort of defensive weapons, but never really pissing off the Kremlin too much, let's really think about, if you're in the Kremlin, how are you going to react to such a person? What are you going to be scared? Are you going to say, okay, the Washington's afraid, and we can be patient? And I even, Jonathan, I think I was trying to figure out, like, why. I don't know if we talked about this last time, but this sort of bizarre thing, like, why does Russia tend to have a major nationwide missile attack in Ukraine about once a week? They took a long pause through the end of 2023, but now they've started to sort of resume it. We're kind of due for one any moment here. And I was thinking, well, wouldn't it be more effective if they just bombed the hell out of, took all these missiles and bombed the hell out of these cities very intensely and just tried to break Ukraine? And I think they know that would reawaken the world as it was in those early days of the full-scale invasion. And so what they want to do now, they look at the weakness in Washington and in Brussels and other places, and they say, we just have to kind of keep this war alive, keep Ukraine an untenable place, so you can never open the airports and have normal life. Just keep these weekly bombings up until and as we see this working, like, all of a sudden, yeah, no wonder Republicans and others are, in some ways, I understand the Republican criticism on two ways, because A, people are tired of 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so anytime they hear war, they're going to run away from it. I understand that. So am I. And then B, they see, well, we don't see a serious policy for victory. We see timidity. And that timidity is not inspiring.
In some ways, a lot of initiative has been lost. And I know the media focuses on that initiative on the front lines and so on, but there's a lot of political capital that's been lost as well, isn't there? As you say, the sort of dynamism, the sense that a victory is possible. That is, unfortunately, a lot of people, I think, would get behind supplying Ukraine if they had a sense that victory was imminent and easier than it is. There are, however, noises in Europe, and there are movements towards rearming. And you have countries that are really out in front, like Estonia and Denmark. Denmark, in particular, has said that they're going to give their entire stock of artillery ammunition and artillery pieces to Ukraine. Now, that might not be a huge amount, but the gesture of handing over everything, because it accepts a certain reality that there will not be Russian troops on Danish streets anytime soon, and that actually giving Ukraine everything it needs makes that likelihood far, far less. It's an extraordinary expression of reality. What do we need to see then on other countries, and what is preventing them from doing so? I mean, Canada is an interesting case as well. Canada seems to have done barely anything when you compare it to some other Eastern European countries in terms of supply. Are they scared of their own internal divisions? Are they scared of Russian active measures through, say, sort of truckers' strike and some of the more extreme points of view that seem to have gripped the country?
Well, for one, speaking of Canada and the trucker strikes, if hardworking people in North America, throughout North America, truly knew the story of Maidan, they would be having those trucker strikes in favor of sending support to Ukraine. And this is a story that the Russians and others have totally eclipsed. But if you're hardworking people throughout the free world, especially in North America, if they knew the real story of Ukrainians standing for faith, family, freedom, they'd be having protests saying, "Why will you not support this country?" And then there's sort of there's a couple of things behind that. One, I know Americans don't care about treaties and memorandums that we signed decades ago. I understand that it's some different time, different people. But it's important to note that because of that Budapest memorandum, which Bill Clinton he recently apologized for, Ukraine gave up its nukes. But not only that, throughout the 90s and even into the 2000s, in fact, there was an initiative former when he was Senator Barack Obama, Democrat, and Republican Dick Lugar of Indiana they pushed through a funding bill in Congress and the two of them came to Ukraine in the early 2000s to oversee the dismantling of Ukraine's weapons. So the nukes were already gone, but of other weapons. So the United States actively de-armed Ukraine and pushed them into it. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians had this extraordinary revolution that should be a model and a beacon of hope to people around the world. And that revolution, by the way, it's important to underscore the Maidan Revolution. There was no looting of stores. There was the only people. There was a clash between the regime and the people, but the people didn't become lawless. In fact, a friend of mine said that the people gathered in the main square, hundreds of thousands of people, was the first successful Ukrainian state. They were disciplined and focused, and they really provide an example that's too powerful of how you can stand up to tyranny, and even beyond that, to stand. I mean, I know people around the world are frustrated. They feel prices are high, the food they eat is terrible. Even the president said this in the Super Bowl message. The packages are getting bigger and the food's getting smaller. All those frustrations are legitimate, and Ukrainians are pointed the way that you don't have to be controlled by corporations and elites, and you can live a wonderful life as you see fit in society, and all that gets missed. So I think if the more people could see that message, and also realize that United States did actively, the elites of the U.S. did actively, on the left and the right, work to de-arm Ukraine, and then the fact that, and there was a Spaces on X, SpaceX, X, whatever it's on Elon Musk Twitter, now known as X, and he's got a thing called Spaces, and he had 3 United States senators, among them J.D. Vance, and J.D. Vance from Ohio was saying, this is 2 weeks ago or so, that the United States defense industry is dilapidated and depleted, and they've given everything to Ukraine. No. Last year, 2023, was the most profitable year ever for U.S. defense products. And here's sort of the trickiest thing to navigate. So the U.S. defense industry is making lots of money right now because of this situation in the world. Now, what Russian propaganda wants Americans and others to think, so if I support Ukraine, I'm supporting the defense machine. No. If you support a long war where Russia attacks Ukraine with these weekly billion-dollar missile attacks, you support a long war, the West refuses to give Ukraine weapons to actually win, then you are supporting the defense military-industrial complex machine. You're not supporting Ukrainians. If you move for a quick victory, you're supporting freedom and security around the world. One of the opponents of quick victory, which I know also from some of the defense contractors who come here, who I've met trying to seize opportunities here, is not just Russia, but the people who stand to make a buck from this going on for a long time, and they justify it in many ways. Most of them aren't actively trying to do evil, but the defense industry profits by Ukrainians holding on, giving them just enough to keep going, and making the world, especially Europe, scared, so that they buy tons and tons of defense products from the U.S. It's a great setup for the defense industry. But this is where we have to cut through it and say that's not what Ukraine's about. That's not the story of Ukraine. And actually, if we get weapons quickly to Ukraine, that's something that Russia doesn't want, and also many people in the elite profit-making defense business do not want.
And of course, the balance here, the balance of that calculus, depending on how cynical we think that is, I also think that there's quite a lot of there's quite a lot of thinking within, say, the Biden, those that are advising on national security, that are genuinely, frightened about Third World War, nuclear, etc., Russia collapsing, total chaos. These are narratives that have been very artfully seeded by Russia into their heads, not just in the last couple of years, but over many, many decades. It's one of the reasons why those Budapest memorandums were signed in the first place. They were projecting their own potential nuclear terrorism onto Ukraine, a country that is highly unlikely to ever to behave in that fashion. So we have a number of sort of narratives that are playing there, and we have a number of players with a varying degree of cynicism as well. When you combine that all together, we're at a real risk, aren't we? We're at a real risk with Russia, which fundamentally is weak. Fundamentally, they're expending vast amounts of their army on very little gains. And when I saw a calculation that it would take something like 175 years to get to Kiev at their current rate of progress, and they need something like 65 billion people in order to do it using the meat wave tactics. So first of all, why are we playing this game? I mean, this will be the last question now. We're coming to the end here. Why are we playing this game here where, we're just putting everything on a kind of seesaw, on a pivot, and risking gambling defeat because things are on a knife edge? It's almost like a race to see who's going to crumble first. Is Russia going to crumble first? Are we going to crumble first? It's an extraordinary high-risk scenario that we are setting up, when in fact, I don't know if you would agree, victory could be achieved, I won't say relatively easily because it's coming at a high cost, but Ukraine could clearly, I think, achieve its aims with the right sort of support.
Yeah, and actually, and maybe this is the opportunity we have now, 2 years into this. So, okay, I can understand why the first weeks and months of the full-scale invasion, everyone outside of Ukraine thought it was going to fall and they were terrified. But now look at how the Ukrainians have held on, and look at, for example, what Ukrainians have been able to do to Russia's Navy, the Black Sea Fleet. I mean, so many ships have been destroyed in the second half of 2023 since the expiration of the grain treaty. It was about one a month, major ship, and now it's one every 2 weeks. This is like MacGyvering things. This is because they don't have permission or the weapons to use it from the U.S., but they are able to use sea drones and others to attack Russian ships. It's extraordinary, and it's working. And we see that Russia doesn't have major responses. I mean, look at how many times Ukrainians have hit Sevastopol. I think we just have to look at that and take courage and assess it and say, Russia never has a great response to this. And the best, just imagine if, whether it's, let's say, the city of Kharkiv, 30 miles from Russia, all of a sudden you have long-range weapons protecting that city and that region, so that Russians have to, as they had to do in 2022, push back their offensive lines deeper into Russia. So actually creating some kind of no man's land, making it harder for Russians to attack Ukraine. And you can do that. That's already been done in many places in 2022. And so just seeing how, piece by piece, you can actually achieve these pretty extraordinary victories that all of a sudden open up the possibility of Ukraine surviving. And this is what I see. It's why I go so often to that city of Kharkiv. Like I know regular civilians, like Ukrainian women who briefly became refugees and they went to Germany or Spain, and they purposely, since those Russian New Year's attacks, have moved back to Kharkiv because they want to say, even if no one hears them, I mean, I'll tell their story, but even if no one hears them, they want to say, my presence here means we will not be defeated. And it's that type of micro courage. It's actually macro, really, because it's there at the front, that if we could take heart from that and say we can actually turn this around. And I think, maybe we can do it as a surprise, but we have an opportunity now. And I think looking at even in the politics in the U.S., this is, people want leadership. I said, they're not timidity. And, even if you have to, just watch The Darkest Hour. Just look at the stories of the 1930s. The conversation, especially in that movie, The Darkest Hour, it's Hollywood, but I worked for a woman who was Churchill's last private secretary. So I had some of this access to personal stories of Churchill. And think of the conversations between Churchill and King George, and they were terrified. They were scared of Hitler, of course. But then they resolved together. Let's stand up together. Look to the Baltic leaders and how the resolve that they have. And so this is, I think, a moment we have to find our mettle, but even find some joy and say, like 2 years on, we've shown this is possible. Let's put an end to it. And not put an end to it. No, let's make victory happen for Ukrainians, but we have to define what it is. And if you're going to refuse to define it, if you're ever going to say again the words "as long as it takes," you should just surrender, because it's the same thing. And what you're doing is you're wasting people's money, you're wasting time, and you're letting more people die. So I think this is a time we have to say, what side are you on? Do you actually believe that free people can win? Ukrainians have proved it. And by the way, this also benefits the U.S. And that's another thing that gets missed. But Ukrainians, with their ingenuity, are able to test American systems, and they're able to improve them and adapt them, and it will make us all more secure. And well, I think that just comes down. I don't know, Jonathan. It's a lot of it comes down to again, I've asked myself the tough question. If I had never ever been to Ukraine, the first time I came here was 2018, and being from the world of Fox News, but not just that. I mean, I wasn't just the world of Fox News. One of my first mentors was Bill Kristol, the leader of the Never Trumpers. I've been involved in all these aspects: the pro-Trump sides, the anti-Trumpers, Republicans and Democrats, the war machine, the anti-war machine. And if I had never been to Ukraine, this is a tough thing for me to realize. There was a good chance I'd be saying a lot of the things they're saying in the White House. Let's we're scared. Let's keep it easy. Henry Kissinger school. Keep everything in some balance while we drink our champagne or whatever. And part of the reason why I left that world, I knew something was missing. I knew we were missing a piece of the story. We talked about freedom, but I knew we weren't living like free people. We were disconnected from humanity. And I do think one of the very best things that anyone can do, even if you come here secretly, come to Ukraine. It's inspiring. Every single person I've brought here, I bring them to Lviv, and somehow I convince them to come with me to Kharkiv, 30 miles from Russia. And people are very brave for doing that, and they don't want to leave. Here they find some reservoir of truth and integrity and courage. And I think that it comes down to that. I think this battle line here and that border between these countries is the divide between the epitome of victimhood, helplessness, and tyranny, and the epitome of resilience, of possibility, of good and decent life and freedom. And so many of our problems in the rest of the world is in the spectrum in between those two ideas. And I think there's a bright, beautiful possibility that if we really began to pay attention to what's happening here, I think it could help us fix a lot of our problems. It would give a lot of encouragement and inspiration to I speak as an American, and I think the Brits have done this so well. Like, that's one thing that unifies you with all the other problems in the UK. The Brits can be proud and thinking of your history from World War II and how you alone in Europe didn't fall when all of Europe fell. Now Ukrainians are doing the same, and you recognize it. And I hope it trickles down to a feeling that people feel throughout that country, and I see it with the volunteers that come here. And this is what we need. We need inspiration in life. I mean, I'm sure you've read Dostoevsky a lot, right? And I
Yep.
think so much of his book Demons in that was taking over Russian culture in the 19th century. And when I look at a lot of American art and cinema and movies, I do see this. We either have nihilism or we have like superhero movies that are totally unattainable and fanciful. And how do we want to live our lives? Because right now we're living in in the middle where we don't have any, we watch someone else's life. And here, we as a society, for the first time ever, like I see this happening every day. Individual Americans outfitting Ukrainian soldiers, individual Americans sending money for drones to stop the enemy. This is the best superhero movie you could ever have.
And it's a collective thing, isn't it? It's not an individual going out there with some superpowers on their own, but it's that realization that you do have agency, that you shouldn't just be sitting there consuming information and letting it control your mood, letting it control your actions. If you find, kindred spirits or like-minded souls, you can go out and change everything. And I think that's what Ukrainians have definitely shown us. The NAFO movement as well. It shows that, we're sitting here with our computers and so on, but actually you can make a difference, and then you can make connections in the real world. You can meet up with people and you can actually sort of do stuff that enhances freedom, innovation, all these things we're talking about. And just to sort of end there on the thought that this idea of being preemptively scared, preemptively afraid, we've got to get away from that. I think Timothy Schneider points this out, that if you do this, if you behave like that, then the tyrant has already won half the battle. So no preemptive fear or checking of your actions. And to an extent, Navalny has said the same. There's the famous placard he holds up in one of his trials. I'm not afraid. Don't you be afraid either. And I think this is an incredibly important message there. We need to hold ourselves up as independent people with agency, and we need to find commonality, even with people who may have a very different political perspective on the world. We can't let ourselves be othered or divided in a way, because that destroys any potential we have to actually use our agency. Cancels it out. So I think it's an incredibly important set of thoughts there. I'll give you the final phrase before we sign off.
Well, Jonathan, I like this idea, and I think it comes down to what we feel in our hearts and inspiration. And if you think about it as an American, like, okay, let's say you're angry about the border and all that. Okay, once that's solved, what next? Is everything fixed? Or are you still gonna be angry about something? And like deeply, fundamentally angry. And there's some deeper problem that we need to fix. And here in Ukraine, there's a lot of problems. Like at any moment you get hit by a missile. That's a big problem. There's such a cohesion in society. And I saw this even before in the pandemic. There was normal political nasty disputes, but especially now, there's a joy that people have. And it's possible to have this vision of a great life, and even in this hell. And so somehow we could use this story to break through the people that try to manipulate us, which I know intimately because I was protégé to the chairman of Fox News, who was one of the best ever. He was a P.T. Barnum of our time, one of the best manipulators, because it was profitable and other reasons. But there's many others like him on left and right. And we have to choose not to be. So the first step of that is not just taking what everyone tells us as fact, from the media, and begin to talk with each other. And I do believe that Ukraine will be the key to fixing a lot of our problems. And that's why not just I'm here, but so many foreigners are here every single day.
It's incredibly important, and I advise people to sort of watch your broadcast, especially in the run up to the second anniversary. We're going to be putting content out on Saturday from London, where there will be a lot of NAFO people, a lot of Ukrainians, and hopefully a lot of others joining in to remember what is an appalling anniversary, but also celebrate the resilience of Ukrainians. Joe, thank you so much. I look forward to our next chance to chat, and I'm sure a lot will have happened in the intervening days.
Jonathan, thank you. Joe Lindsley, WGN Radio, every single day, available at UkrainianFreedomNews.com, YouTube, Spotify, etc.
We'll put links in the description. Thanks so much. Good luck. Stay safe.
Thank you, Jonathan.